Thank you for joining us today for our Vote In or Out Mayoral Forum series, which is designed to give candidates a chance to inform the voters directly about their platforms and about their stances on the issues. At Vote In or Out, we believe a better informed electorate and increased voter participation provides for a better democracy. We encourage all citizens to get informed, get involved, and to be the change they wish to see. Today, we're joined by mayoral candidate Art Chang, who is running as a Democrat to be the next mayor of the city of New York. Hi, Art. I'm Michael Sharafo, co-founder and political director over here at Vote In or Out. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Why don't we start off with a little introduction? Tell us a little bit about yourself in your own words. Who is Art Chang?
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for having me on. I'm so delighted to be here and to be introduced to your audience. So thank you so much. I'm a resident of Brooklyn, so you're filming me here in Brooklyn. I've been in New York since 1985. I moved here with $400 in my pocket, and I really struggled for a while. I started a business, I went bankrupt, but I got back on my feet and was able to, grow my career. I have had an amazing wonderful journey over the past 30 years through government and also through the private sector. I'm a child of immigrants who grew up actually in white middle America and never fit the image of what you're supposed to look like. So I know what it's like not to belong, and that's why I came to New York City. And that's why I want New York City to remain the place where everyone belongs and where the city actually works for everyone. And I'm committed to making that dream of New York City a reality for everyone.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Let's get right into it. What would you say are your top 3 issues facing New York City that you want to tackle if elected mayor, and how will you address those issues with your proposed policies?
Well, I'm actually going to give you 4 top priorities because I think these are the things that are on people's minds.
Okay.
The first one is we have to manage COVID. And we have to manage the COVID crisis. This means restoring health to all of our communities, getting people vaccinated, but it also means getting people back to work and kids back in their schools. The second is we really have to handle this eviction crisis. Right, it is so massive right now, and depending on who's counting, there are $2 to $3 billion worth of debt that have been accumulated by residents and landlords. And unless we figure out how to deal with that, that's going to push a lot of people off the financial cliff. The third thing that we have to do is get our economy back on its feet. And that's not going to happen through big businesses. It's going to happen through small businesses. And so we need to do everything we can to, keep people in their homes and keep small businesses in their stores and in their offices and build back from there. And then the fourth thing is education. That we need an education system that meets every student where they are. A lot of pain and disruption has happened over the past year to both the students and also the educators, as well as everybody's families. So we need to figure out how we do this in a way that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, I did a little bit of research before the interview, and I took a look at your platform listed on your website so I could get an idea of
Thank you.
What you stand for and what you're looking to do. So I'd just like to go a little bit deeper into some of the policy positions I saw listed.
Absolutely.
Great. So one of the plans I saw you'd love to implement if you're elected mayor is a universal childcare plan. Could you tell us more about that plan and how it would work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the plan builds off of, Mayor de Blasio's, maybe arguably his major signature achievement, which is universal pre-K4. There are lots of shortcomings in it, but he got it done. And that's the important part. So we can really build off of that. So what I'm envisioning is universal childcare for children ages 1 through 4. That's available 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., 12 months a year. And that these centers would be located within a 15-minute walk of every family in New York City. Now, we know that there are three primary benefits to doing this. And one that I'll give you one overall one. The first one is that, women have been the most adversely affected by COVID. So parenting, the struggles of balancing parenting and work has really taken an unequal toll on women. Women's participation in the workforce right now is about where it was in 1989. So in just a matter of a year, we've lost 30 years worth of women's progress, economic progress. The second thing is that, we've talked about equity and establishing equity, across the city. Well, the best place to start is in early childhood, because that's where physical development and intellectual development really happens. So if we can level the playing field through nutrition, through monitoring kids' development and giving them the stimulus and other things they need for them to develop properly, and then we have a great chance of doing that. And we know that from all the studies that this actually has great payoffs even decades later. And then the third thing is that this would create thousands of jobs, good jobs that pay living wages with real benefits. And so this would be a huge boost to the overall economy. There's a University of Chicago Nobel laureate economist named James Heckman, who estimates that doing universal childcare could have as much as a 13.3% annual ROI for the city or the state that would do this. So I think all the arguments are there in place, and I have to say, I don't see how New York City can afford not to do this.
Now, another hot button issue is a housing issue. As you mentioned, housing has been hit hard, especially with this pandemic, to an already existing problem that existed before the pandemic. So I see that you have a very ambitious housing plan in your agenda, and that includes canceling debt, housing the homeless, building new housing, and fixing the backlog of NYCHA repairs. Can you tell us a little bit more about that housing plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So just in a nutshell, the principal problem is that the city's population has grown by about 1 million people over the past 30 years. But we've only built about 250,000 units of housing. So what happens when the demand goes up and the supply doesn't go up? Well, you have an affordability problem. The other thing that happened was that we had the income gap between people who were wealthy and people who weren't really grew tremendously. And so even though that happened during this time, the city added almost no units of low income housing. And so the evidence is right there in NYCHA. I mean, NYCHA was designed to hold about 440,000 people, but instead it houses about 640,000. Right, and then the eviction crisis is absolutely enormous, right? And we always have to remember that this is also small businesses, right? There are about 300,000 eviction cases pending in housing court, which is like the equivalent size of Boston. And then we have another 50,000 homeowners, who, have a townhouse or, row house, and they have a tenant, and they're in, property tax default. So we have all of this. The moratorium has created, almost $3 billion of debt. So how are we going to fix this? Well, there are a few things that we can do. Number one is we can work with the banks to restructure the mortgages for the landlords. And we have to remember that not all the landlords are giant corporations, with deep pockets. A lot of the landlords are small mom and pops, immigrant families who are trying to build wealth, and they're really, really seriously affected. So we want to basically be able to work with the banks to be able to extend the mortgages. So if you can imagine cutting the mortgage like at a certain point and then just separating it so you have a mortgage-free period, that's what I'm envisioning. And I know it can be done. I mean, my last job was working for JP Morgan Chase. I know that this can be done. So that's on the mortgage side. Now, the city also has a role to play because we charge property taxes. The property taxes went up actually during COVID because of the previous assessments. And then fees and other things also went up. So there's a lot of accrued debt from that. And the city just needs to figure out how to put a stop to this excess penalties that they're charging landlords, like 18% interest rate on some of the delinquent mortgages. And we need to give people a breathing room. I mean, people, especially landlords, will make good on their payments, but it's going to take some time. And so the city can come back and restructure that. Now, we talked about NYCHA. Let me talk about NYCHA for a second. So NYCHA is in dire conditions. Everybody knows. And there's all this debate over the RAD program or not the RAD program, but the RAD program is only going to deal with about 15% of the units of NYCHA. I think there's an interesting opportunity to look at all of NYCHA and ask what would happen if we actually turn the ownership of NYCHA over to its tenants. Well, could we actually have social ownership and give people some kind of equity, however limited, in some of the same ways that Co-op City operates up in the Bronx, right? You look at how that works. It is a stable, low to middle income community. And so I think we have a chance to look at NYCHA and think about doing something like that as a way to refinance NYCHA so that we can unlock money, capital to go and renovate it. On the homelessness problem, we have about 60,000 people who are homeless. A large number of them are mentally ill. We have amazing nonprofits in the city who do, homeless transition back to, permanent housing, and also to deal with, the supportive housing needed for the mentally ill. We need to act very quickly and actually get these people in homes. The city has what's called a first lien right to take over properties that are in mortgage delinquency. The class of properties that has the highest mortgage delinquency are hotels, not surprisingly. So we can take over a lot of these hotels and use them temporarily, but we can't do it the way that this mayor has done it so far, where you just put people in these places without any supportive services. That makes no sense. We have to work very closely with the nonprofit partners to the city and ensure that the services that are needed, whether it's a mentally ill homeless person or a homeless family, are there to support them so that they can actually make a transition back to a stable life. And it's going to take some time, it's going to take some money, but we got to do it. Creating low-income housing is an imperative, right? So if you look at the eviction crisis and you look at, that size of the population of Boston potentially facing eviction, well, that's the size of our low-income crisis. And, we have to think about, first of all, how we keep people in their homes. I think that's the most cost-effective thing to do. It costs the city between $176 and to $240 a night to temporarily house a homeless individual or family. So you just multiply those numbers times 30, that's a lot of money, right? $3 billion a year out the door paying for this kinds of transitional housing. It's cheaper to keep people in their homes and subsidize their rent. And I think we're going to have to do that while we have a massive program to build low-income housing.
Well, clearly you have a command of the issues on housing and childcare, and you have proposed some bold solutions to address them. Well, here comes here comes the fun part. How do you plan to find the funding for such an ambitious plan for both childcare and housing?
Well, let's start with childcare. The current pre-K4 costs around $1.1 billion. So extending it an additional 3 years, plus adding the summer in and lengthening the hours. So let's say it's going to be $5 to $6 billion. I've proposed a $1.3 billion cut to the NYPD that could be used for the down payment. But the other thing, and the more important thing, is really thinking about the city's budget. I don't know if you know this, but the city's budget is $92 billion. But just 8 years ago, it was $70 billion. With inflation, the real dollar value of that increase has been about $18 billion. So I figure that there's probably about $10 billion there of duplicative services, unnecessary bureaucracy, overhead, and administration that we can whittle away at and start to transfer this money down to the frontline work across the city. I mean, across the city. So to Universal Childcare itself, so that kind of efficiency, those kinds of efficiency gains can be redirected to universal childcare. But the other aspect is that we also are in a period where we are getting funding from the federal government. Now, how long it lasts and how much it is and how frequently it comes is really up in the air. And so we can't actually count on it. But that money there are earmarks within that money for things like expanding, payment for daycare and childcare, creating universal pre-K-3. So the state and the city are going to get some assistance from the federal government. And then in addition, there's a whole hot debate right now over raising taxes in the legislature. So as a mayor, the prudent approach is not to count on some, manna from heaven coming down and blessing us with all this money. But we're gonna have to think about managing the city's budget much more tightly, the way that you manage your own money and then I manage my money. So to think about reducing costs, eliminating unnecessary expenses, tightening our belt, getting efficiencies. And to do this, we're going to have to work with our labor partners. And I know the labor partners are eager to have this conversation.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about, you have on your website that you are committed to saving the restaurants in New York City. Clearly, this pandemic has really put the hurt on them and just destroyed businesses that are never going to come back. And, jobs were lost that it's going to take some time to get back. How do you envision saving the restaurants if elected mayor?
Well, the first thing is, by the way, I worked in restaurants for 4 years, and I've worked in almost every job in a restaurant, and many of my friends own restaurants and work in restaurants. So restaurants are very near and dear to me. It's the first thing we have to do is really look at, use our business knowledge and look at what a restaurant needs. Right? Restaurant owners are extremely savvy business people. They can adjust their variable costs, which are largely food and labor. But the fixed costs are really, really hard. The rent is the largest fixed cost. The second one, are the taxes. And then you have the, onerous kinds of penalties and fines from all these regulators coming in and trying to ticket these restaurants for minor infractions. And I think we have to kind of stop all that. We have to keep restaurants in their stores and use some of the same techniques that I talked about for housing. We have to think about the taxes and actually waive taxes, waive fees if necessary to keep them in their stores. They're getting a big boost right now from outdoor seating. Well, let's continue that outdoor seating to 2022 and maybe even indefinitely, because we have to re-envision our streets. And there's a huge motivation, a huge imperative to do that for all kinds of really, really good reasons. But having restaurants on the streets is a great idea. And then there are other things that a mayor can do that no one is talking about. For example, credit card fees are, take away, through 2 to 7% of a restaurant's, revenue, just when anybody goes in and uses a credit card. And MasterCard and Visa were just talking about raising those fees by 1 to 2%. Well, the mayor may not be able to control that, but the mayor certainly has a call on the people who run those organizations, because they are headquartered right here in the city. So why don't we organize with them? And by the way, why don't we at the same time think about how we develop some competition within that field so that we can actually lower those fees? And then the city also has a huge marketing platform. There's so much we can do to ensure that the people of the city know who's open, when they're open, what's open. Can we do things like provide, coupons and badges and things for, to encourage people to go out and dine at these restaurants? So there's so much that we can do. But then the final thing, and I alluded to this before, is really, how do we align all the different regulatory entities? A restaurant faces 8 different regulators. Why don't we actually align them so that there's a single process that is designed for oriented toward the restaurant's success, not to play gotcha with the restaurants.
Okay, thank you for that. As you mentioned earlier, you have called for defunding the police, and to the tune of about $1.3 billion.
That's right.
So my question then, sir, is given your proposal, how do you plan to implement such drastic cuts to the police force? And how will you ensure those cuts won't affect the level of safety afforded to New York City residents?
So I want to make a couple points right off the bat. Number one, I hate that term defund the police, because we're going to have policing. And if you bring the policing budget down to zero, that just won't work. So this has to be done in a common sense way. There's a blog post that's on my site that I wrote with my two kids and my niece last summer that kind of goes through line by line, where did this come from? The biggest thing is that you can actually save a huge amount of money by deferring, the next police officer class or just canceling it. There's some other cuts that can be done kind of across the board. The police budgets, police department's budget has grown enormously. And the other thing is we have to ask, are we getting enough out of our police force for what we're paying? New York City is in the top 4 in the country in terms of the number of police officers per capita. I don't know if anyone understands that. And those other cities are far more dangerous and crime-ridden than New York City. When you look at the number of police officers we have per murder, like we're off the charts. And the police force that we have is actually not small. It is kind of within a historical range of police, officers in the city. Like even during the height of the crack epidemic, when things were really bad, the police force has never been more than about 41,000 uniformed officers. So we need to figure out how we make this more efficient. And part of it is actually looking at and understanding what the nature of the crimes are. We know nationally that 94% of 911 calls do not require armed intervention. And in fact, we also know that armed intervention often escalates and causes a lot of other costs down the road, both human and financial. Now, there's an arrest, there's jails, there's incarceration, the social effects of that. There's a court system, and then there's also that escalation of violence, which often happens when police officers show up when they're not necessarily needed. So what I'm proposing is that we create a rapid response force that looks much like the CAHOOTS program in Oregon, where you have a rapid response team that's equipped to operate 24/7, 365, just like the police. And it consists of a violence interrupter, social worker, mental health professionals, and send them out right in place of the police, but with police backup standing by and ready to help if armed intervention is necessary. All the studies that have been done around the country for this kind of intervention has shown that it lowers temperatures, it de-stresses communities, and it leads to better outcomes. So I think we have to do that. And these forces, by the way, also are less expensive than police officers. Right now, I mean, we've had the largest growth in non-uniformed civilian personnel in the police force in the department's history. So we can get rid of a lot of those folks. We just don't need them. So those are some of the things that I would do. I think there's also a lot of willingness in the police department to try out alternative things. There's an experiment going on right now to use EMS. There's a really fantastic test in one of the precincts of actually taking police officers off the street entirely for a weekend. And that was a great success. So I think there are a lot of ways that we can move the city toward de-escalating tensions and making it safer for everybody.
On the topic of safety, as you know, and as all New Yorkers have seen, particularly lately, but really the past year, I want to just talk about the uptick in AAPI hate that's been happening. I understand that you were born in Atlanta, Georgia, to Korean immigrants during the Jim Crow era, and
That's right.
then you moved on to Ohio growing up, and you were raised in an all-white neighborhood.
That's right.
Um, and you say that, you know, the way you were treated there and the way it was there, you say that that's what made you decide to leave Ohio and come to New York, a much more welcoming place, according to you.
That's right.
Um, Now, given the recent increase in hate attacks and just general racism aimed at the AAPI community, how do you feel about making that move now? And how do you believe that, you know, this problem can be addressed to lessen the amount of hate attacks being committed against the AAPI community?
Those are all great questions. I love the city and I'm not leaving. The city is my home. I found love here. I raised a family. I built a home. I mean, literally. And, I've created 12 startups and started 12 companies here, including 11 tech startups. I mean, I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere. I've been here for 35 years. This was my lifelong dream to be here. And part of it is the creative capital of the world, and that's not going to change. Um, you know, you asked a very good question because, I came to New York, and for a while, for a long time, I was able to forget that I'm Asian. I was just a person. I was just a New Yorker. And what's happened over the past year has made me remember that I'm Asian. I'm different. I'm a foreigner in some respects. I'm an immigrant, and I feel different for the first time since since I was a kid. I don't feel as threatened, although I do worry that when my son goes out on the subway alone and doesn't come back till late at night, I do worry. And so we have to think about that. But here's what really encourages me, and there are some things that really encourage me. Number one is that there has been such an outpouring of support for the Asian communities from other communities who experience discrimination and hatred. The Jewish community has faced anti-Semitism. They have open arms to the Asian community, the Black community, the Muslim community. I mean, this is really a time when we are seeing this terrible hate, but we're also seeing the communities who are receiving that hate all standing together. The public advocate Jumaane Williams at a peace vigil after the Atlanta shootings said a very powerful thing that resonated with me and other Asian leaders, which is that, he said, I remember when Asians stood with us during the BLM protests, and we are here to stand with you. And the sort of notion of solidarity is very powerful. And I don't want to leave out white allies too, because the text messages I get, the emails I get asking me how I am, well, that's amazing. It's like it reminds me of the warmth and generosity and support of New York. It is the best of what New York is all about, and we are going to get through this thing. The causes for this are very deep, and they're not going to go away very soon. And to some extent, I feel a little bit embarrassed that we haven't. I personally haven't been more involved. We have, with Trump starting to talk about the Wuhan virus, the China flu, with people feeling this deep economic unease, there's, it seemed like almost inevitable that there would be some kind of, an outpouring of anger with Asians as the victims of that. So, we need to kind of remind people and get back to a place where people understand, we're not the model minority, that Asians actually have the highest level of poverty in New York City of any ethnic group. I don't know if you know that. The other thing that is astonishing is that the economic damage to the Asian community, we have the highest level of unemployment of any ethnic group in the city. We have the lowest weekly wages of any ethnic group in the city. And then when quarantine hit, retail sales, like restaurant sales in Chinatown went down by 98%. And in Flushing, it went down by 80%. So we have been disproportionately harmed. And yet this model minority myth, I think gives people this false illusion that we as a people are prosperous and having the unfair and unjust rewards from, the civil rights struggle and all that stuff. So I think that's going to take some time to overcome. It's going to take education in the schools, bringing Asian history in, Black history into the schools, so that people understand that we have all experienced these kinds of things together, and that we're all together in making a fairer, more just, and more equitable and more safe city.
If you become mayor, you will be the first Asian mayor in New York City history. We've had an Asian controller in John Liu, but this issue, this uptick in hate directed at Asians and the API community, like, what, as a mayor from that level, from City Hall, from the Blue Room, can a mayor do to lessen and discourage and end this hate going on in our city? Is it something that can be done through law enforcement, or their education programs? What can a mayor do to try and lessen the amount of hate attacks that we've been seeing? Is there anything?
Absolutely. I mean, the mayor can do many things, and I think in this time of the mayor that we have, and even the previous mayor, we kind of have lost sight of some of the tools that our mayor has. A mayor is a powerful convening force, right? The mayor can ask people to come to a meeting, and they will show up. We need people from different communities coming together and thinking collectively about how we address this issue. We need to figure out how we actually help create safety on our streets. I think I saw some of the videos of the man being punched in the subway, the woman on the street, some of these other incidents. We need to be able to train bystanders in what they're supposed to do. What can they do and maintain their own safety? How do you intervene in a situation like this? We don't provide training like that to anybody, and we could do that. We could do that citywide, because we all see these kinds of things, whether it's domestic violence in the family who lives in the apartment next door to you, or other situations like this, teen bullying, whatever it might be. The city as a whole can be de-escalated, and we can form tighter alliances among us. And the mayor has a very, very important role there. The mayor can also unilaterally interject, history courses, right, in the school system. That is provided the mayor has control. But with the collaboration of the teachers and families and students, we can do these kinds of things to help bring more understanding to people, and we can include families in some of that education as well. And then the final thing is that the mayor just has to be there. The mayor just has to show up. So, I have this vision that when I come into office, that I'm going to take myself and my top deputies, and we are going to go and create a mini city hall for a week, a month, in other parts of the city, so we can actually see firsthand what's going on. So there have been a lot of shootings in some of the housing projects and some of the Black neighborhoods. Well, we need to plant ourselves right there so that we can see firsthand and understand what's going on. Bring visibility to the issues of those families in that community. We need to do the same thing with the Asian community, where we see these episodes of hate crimes. We need to be there. The mayor needs to ride the subway, so that you actually understand, people understand that the mayor rides the subway like everybody else. and that the kinds of things that the mayor is going to look out for his or her own safety is going to be the thing that people should expect for themselves. And that's how we're going to do that. So it's not going to happen overnight, but the mayor has to be present and be willing to put himself or herself right in those places. And I promise to do that.
Okay, thank you for that. Very good answer to that question. I appreciate it. I want to turn a little bit to education. You know, this country's been through a lot the past year. Parents have been struggling to balance work and home life with, kids being homeschooled virtually while they're trying to do jobs. So education has become a really important issue right now. Um, if you're elected mayor, do you have someone in mind to be the next school's chancellor? And if not, could you tell us a little bit about what qualities or experience you're hoping that the person you choose to be the school's chancellor will possess?
Absolutely. Let me actually just start with just talking about the governance of the school system. Right now, it's under sole mayoral control. And one of the things that I've said to the teachers union, but I say this to anybody, because I think this also relates to the NYPD and the police chief, is that absolute power corrupts absolutely. There is no single person who should have absolute control over everything in the city. American democracy is based on checks and balances, right? You have an executive, you have a legislature, you have a court system, and those actually work, off of each other. So I would want to make sure that the mayor does have control, not the state or a board, but the mayor has an active advisory board that consists of parents, educators, and even students, and that the recommendations of that board are really meaningful, that those recommendations are transparent, they're made public, and if the mayor and the chancellor choose to do something different, then everybody needs to know. And the mayor has the obligation to explain why, and then have the mayor's feet held to the fire. All right, but that way we get some real checks and balances without slowing down the decision-making process. As to the chancellor, I think it's really important. Just I think with the mayor, that you have somebody with experience with the existing system. If you don't, I firmly believe that if you do not have somebody who has had hands-on experience working inside the city government, it's going to be almost impossible to figure out how to transform it, because it needs transformation. So you have to have that core expertise. But you also want someone who has a little bit of the outsider's perspective, the ability to look at the system and understand the things that are wrong with it and the shortcomings and what needs to be changed in order to be successful. And then part of that means, the chancellor working with this advisory council and the whole system is going to have to figure out, what does the definition of success mean in education? I think no one can explain to me what successful education means in New York City, except that we know that it's not working. So let's actually, have a definition that we share across the board, and that we set our goals toward working toward that definition of success. And the chancellor is going to be the key player to do that. So I'm very interested in seeing, what the new chancellor does and how she operates. And, I think super interested that should I be elected mayor, would have, delighted to interview her and give her a shot at it.
So you say her, do you have a person in mind to be the next school's chancellor?
No, there is, as Carranza resigned, and we have a new schools chancellor, and not a new schools chancellor, but someone who's been in that system for a very long time. And I've spoken to a lot of the folks who have worked with her, and she is highly respected and well regarded, and people have a lot of confidence that she can run a better school system.
So just to be clear, you support the current school chancellor to continue, if you become mayor?
She would definitely have the first shot at that job.
Okay. On the topic of schools, and you had mentioned the teachers union. So CDC recently revised guidelines for schools to go from 6 feet to 3 feet apart,
Right.
which is going to increase the amount of children that could be at school one time and hopefully get us back to some sort of normalcy. But as you know, New York City has of multiple variants of the coronavirus, which we still don't definitively know how they how they react with the vaccines, if they work against with the vaccines or not. And there's a palpable sense out there of parents who are just so tired of this, and they really want to get their kids back into school. And so there's a very difficult balance that needs to be struck between safety and the ability to get people back to normalcy. And one of your opponents, Andrew Yang, has recently criticized the teachers union for not being conducive to coming back right away. So I just wanted to ask you, in the situation right now between school reopenings and parents being, have had enough, and the teachers union trying to be a little bit more cautious, where do you come down on all this? Who do you, what would you do as far as reopening schools, and what would you say to the unions and parents?
The first thing I would say is that the biggest problem with this mayor is this one-size-fits-all approach, and the decision-making without the consultation or collaboration with the other major stakeholders. It is a truly damaging situation, right? It's an illustration of what is wrong, I think, when a career politician, tries to go and run a city, right? Because it's an executive approach that's determined by politics instead of management, right? He's prioritizing ideology over pragmatism and his own decision-making over collaboration. And then he's solving these problems piecemeal instead of a holistic approach. And what I might say here is that we have 1 million students, we have 120,000 educators. This is a massive system. The fact that not more than 10% of the students are really back in class, despite what the mayor says, just reveals the level of distrust that parents have in the mayor's leadership. And the fact that the teachers are so cautious also reflects that distrust, which is caused by this management style. And so, going back to this one size fits all, we shouldn't have a one size fits all for anything, right? We have 30% of the students in our system have IEPs, right? They have a learning difference. We have another, 10, 20,000 students who are homeless, who have no Wi-Fi, right? So how do they learn? And then we have, hundreds of thousands, I would guess, of students, who haven't really learned that well over this time period. So based upon the educational standards, they also are experiencing a learning difference. And then for so many of them, like where you started off, was this kind of beautiful acknowledgement of all the deaths and the illnesses that have occurred, right? The 30,000 deaths in the city, the tens of thousands of people who remain sick. We have the variants coming along. The next month is going to be super, super dicey and important in how the city rebounds from this. And then the teachers themselves, right? The teachers are just like all of us, right? The teachers, almost 80 teachers have died from COVID, right? And another several dozen are sick or sickened. And then you think of the emotional toll, right? They're also parents. Many of them are parents, and they're also trying to homeschool their kids while they're trying to teach kids, and they have 100, in some cases, 120 students that they're responsible for. So this is an enormous pressure. It's an enormous responsibility. And we're not going to come back like flipping on a switch. You can't blame the U of T and expect everything just to come back if you have a mayor who says everything is going to be okay. It's going to take a lot of work. And what we have to do is we have to have an incremental approach. So there are teachers who have been vaccinated, who don't have comorbidities, who are not living with folks who are ill. We have students whose families want to get them back to school. So why don't we prioritize them? Why don't we prioritize the places where it seems like it's going to be the easiest? And then for the communities, and I think one thing that everyone has noted is that Black and brown communities are the most reluctant to go back to school because I think there's the least amount of trust. So let the folks go back who want to go back, with teachers who want to go back and be there, assuming all the right health conditions, the buildings that are ready, the social spacing, all that stuff. And then let's see how that works, show the data, and gradually begin to move people back into school. And at the same time, we have to look out for people's mental health, the mental health of the students, the families, and the teachers.
Yesterday, the city announced that we have administered 4 million vaccine shots into arms.
I got one of those yesterday.
You did. I was going to ask because, as you know, there is a modicum of vaccine hesitancy out there. And one of my concerns is that if enough people choose not to get the vaccine, that we could miss the mark to achieve that herd immunity that Dr. Anthony Fauci of the NIH always talks about.
That's right.
And so the reason why I was going to ask you if you would roll up your sleeve as mayor to incentivize and encourage New York City residents to get vaccinated. Was that something you would do if you were mayor now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually posted a picture of my shot on all the social media, so everyone can see the witness it. Because I actually show it with the syringe plunged into my arm, look, your chances of being severely injured or killed are much higher if you're driving on the subway, driving on the highway, than it is with the vaccine. It's the vaccine was developed under extraordinary circumstances, so obviously there are definitely potential risks. But I'm also someone who has had a very intimate experience with the medical system. I have severe burns. I spent 14 years getting biannual plastic surgery. I've had 2 hip replacements. I've had 2 ruptured discs in my neck. I have two torn rotator cuffs. I have autoimmune disease, so I have to self-inject twice a month. There are lots of risks in life. And I think the thing that I think about is the well-being of myself and my family. And I think about the well-being of our overall community. And I think the risk to me is worth the safety to the overall community and to my family. And so I'm a big advocate for it. And I will do everything I can to reassure people that the risks are minimal and they can be managed so that we can actually get to a safer place.
If we get to a point where the FDA approves of these vaccines officially and not in just an emergency use capacity, and you are elected mayor, will you mandate that New York City school children must be vaccinated, much like they need for other ailments that we've gotten rid of in the past?
If we get to that point, I think absolutely. I mean, we know that the vaccinations against polio and measles completely transformed, our healthcare system and the populations who were affected. So I think we're going to have to think about something like that. And if the FDA requires it, and then we're going to have to follow suit. If the right when the vaccine is developed for small children and there's a protocol for that, and then I will fully support that the administration of that.
We've seen today, I believe it was Pfizer came out with recent data that shows 100% effectiveness in children ages 12 to 15, which is good news. And the idea is that if that could be approved by the FDA for emergency use authorization, and it is quickly administered to the children of America in age 12 to 15 range, you could have potentially all middle and high schools opened up by September with fully vaccinated children, school staff, teachers. That seems like something we should hope to achieve. Do you think we will get there if that is the case? You think September seems like a too lofty of a goal or something to aim for?
Well, I've been so impressed at how the administration, the Biden administration, has surpassed all of its benchmarks for vaccine distribution so far. I mean, we were talking about 80% by August at the beginning of the year, and now we're already talking about 80% by June. It's an amazing place to be. So I'd like to be optimistic and say that September is feasible. But we have a lot of it's that last mile problem. It's like trying to figure out, so are there enough vaccines, and then how do we distribute them to people to ensure that they actually get them? And that's really the problem that we're having. One of the problems that we're having in New York City and in New York State, and in particular in some of the poor, Black and brown and immigrant communities. It's been, a challenge to reach all the people.
All right, I want to switch topics a little bit. I want to talk about another item I saw on your website. You say that poverty is an LGBT issue, and you've put out a 10-point plan to address it. Could you tell us why you believe poverty is an LGBT issue, and how are some of your proposed policies addressing it?
Well, as a group of people, the queer community is the poorest. I mean, if we were to think of them as an ethnic group, they would be the poorest in the city. The overall income is lowest. The housing is the worst. It's kind of a combination of it's really kind of due to lack of societal acceptance of who they are. There are things like, I can tell you that for trans people, that 40% of homeless teenagers, for example, are queer teenagers who are fleeing household violence in their own homes, right? So when you think about that, and then you kind of extrapolate that out a little bit, and you think about what this means in terms of that person's well-being, their prospects for life, their ability to grow and become a successful adult, they've kind of been set back already. And so when you think about creating safety, sort of economic safety and security, I tend to think about people who are kind of at the bottom. Because when you think about people at the bottom, you can lift all boats. But if you ignore certain groups, and then you're doing so at the peril of all the other folks who are similarly affected. So if we know, for example, that people who are, especially I'm going to focus on trans folks, are especially discriminated against and have a very challenging time. And then we need to figure that out, because there are lots of other people who are discriminated against and have a tough time. Think about kids in foster care, right, who age out of the foster care system, but they end up penniless, and in many cases, they actually end up without their own documents or any identity papers. So these communities have overlapping interests, and when you focus on the ones who are kind of the most affected, it gives you an opportunity to lift all boats. I'll give you another example, which is the disability community. We talk a lot about the streets and how we make the streets better and safer. Well, the best way to make the sidewalks better for everybody is to make them handicap accessible and compliant. Because if they do that, it's great for the elderly, right? It's great for people who are disabled. It's great for parents who are pushing strollers, right? It's great for the parents with little kids. There are all kinds of good things that happen when we think about folks who really are at the margin of our society. And then when we think about the overall kinds of, again, issues of safety and welcoming people, I think about this from my perspective as being Asian and recognizing that I don't feel completely, comfortable in the world. And, we want everyone to feel comfortable in the world. That if you are a resident of New York City, like I want New York City to be the place where everyone can feel safe, where everyone has a roof over their head, they have food, they have access to a quality education, that they have equal opportunity to be able to grow themselves and their families. And so they can have kids and know that their kids are going to have a shot at a better life. And that as they age, that we all can age age with dignity and security and without hardship. Now, those are very lofty aspirations, but I believe that we can get a lot of the way there by more of this bottom-up approach. And so you're hearing this bottom-up approach from me across everything, right? Even the school system, right? Not top-down, not imposing things on people, but bottom-up. Because bottom-up means that we can actually cover almost everybody. We don't exclude anybody. And the top-down approach, as we have seen over and over again, large portions of our population end up getting excluded by those top-down approaches. So I think the management of the city, this comes down to the management and how the next mayor has to manage the city. And I can guarantee you that if the next mayor comes in with a top-down approach, we're going to continue the same patterns of dysfunction that we've had all along.
I want to just touch on veterans. We have lots of veterans in this city. We have a mayoral agency called the Department of Veteran Services, and it only gets about a $4 million budget every year, and it has very few staff, and this has proven to be wholly inadequate to appropriately address the needs of our city's aging veteran population. Do you believe that agency should be expanded and its services should be expanded? And how would you do that?
Well, aging veterans are a special category. They're special in respect in which so many of the populations we have are special. There are lifelong injuries that many veterans have, both internal and external. And so they're like many, many other New Yorkers. The notion of, New York City is a very tough place to get old in, I think, unless you have money. And so we have to address that across the board. So we need to put a lot more money into elder services across the board for veterans and for others. But this is another one of those examples, right? If we use veterans as a particular class of people who are disproportionately, facing hardship, as they age, well, we should focus on them. Because if we focus on them and use them as a standard for the aging services we provide for everybody, and then again, this bottom-up approach will lift all boats. And so that's what we have to do.
So would you increase that budget and staff if you become mayor?
I would increase the budget and maybe meld it into the Department of Aging. We have a department for that. Again, this current mayor likes to fragment everything and put things in individual buckets. So you have, these groups of these people who are supposed to fulfill a function, but they don't have access to the broader budgets, and they don't have access to the broader capabilities. So can we create more integration of these different services? So for amputee veterans, man, they need they need services for disabled people, right? Plus aging. So we need to bring these different departments together and get them to work in unison, which is really going to lead to better outcomes for everybody.
And, finally, I always save the toughest questions for last, so I hope you're ready. I understand that you are somehow responsible for the iconic I voted stickers that we all wear after voting. Could you tell us how you are responsible for those stickers?
Sure. So I'll try to make it as brief as possible. So I was the first Asian appointed to the New York City Campaign Finance Board and served there for nine years. Was appointed by Bloomberg, reappointed by De Blasio. I came, my professional, role at that point was working in technology. So I came to the board, and I couldn't believe that we had a paper voting guide and a very poor website. I also couldn't believe that the city who's responsible for encouraging greater candidate participation in elections was dinging almost every candidate with purported, alleged credit card violations. And I said, well, if Amazon can process, at that point, hundreds of millions of credit card transactions a month, why can't the city process, a couple million, over the term of an election? So we set about trying to fix that and created a private-public partnership to put New York City on the path to 21st century democracy using technology and mobile. And so we did that in a program called NYC Votes. And along the way, we also embraced some other initiatives. We wanted to make increased voter engagement in city elections. So the I Voted sticker came out of that. We created the Youth Poet Laureate program, and that was a direct result of that effort. We had a great staff working on NYC Votes, and so I'm very proud of it. I did not personally create the sticker, but the organization on NYC Votes was the umbrella under which that sticker was created.
Awesome. So in some way, you're responsible for all these selfies that we see every year now. Okay, so at this point of this interview, I'm just going to give you the opportunity to make a closing statement, however you want. You have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah. We need a mayor who's going to move forward to make positive changes with the tools at their disposal, and then create some more. Right? I'll be that mayor. Anyone can come visit me at my Zoom open office hours, which I hold 7 days a week. You can book right on my website at chang.nyc, sign up for my newsletter, and if you're so moved, a $10 contribution will be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much.
Okay, and that concludes this installment of our Vote In or Out Mayoral Forum Series interview with candidate Art Chang, who's running to be the next mayor of New York City. Thank you for spending some time with us today, Art.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.
And to everyone watching, don't forget to go to www.voteinorout.com to learn about all the candidates running for office in New York City this year, including mayor, controller, public advocate, and city council. This is Michael Sharafo of the Vote In or Out team signing off. Thank you for joining us.